On July 8, 2025, former President Donald Trump issued a blunt threat, not through diplomatic channels, but via Truth Social. If Japan and South Korea didn't sign a new trade deal by August 1st, he warned, their exports to the US would face a 25% tariff. It wasn't a proposal, it was an ultimatum. Within hours, stock markets trembled across Tokyo, Seoul, and New York. Allies were rattled, investors panicked. Washington's unpredictability had gone global again, but this time the pushback was immediate. Japan and South Korea didn't just negotiate harder, they turned to a quieter, more stable partner, Canada. So now the question isn't whether tariffs will work. The real question is, what happens when America's closest allies stop trusting America? For decades, the trilateral relationship between the United States, Japan, and South Korea was seen as the cornerstone of economic and strategic cooperation in the Pacific. The US offered security guarantees and access to its vast consumer market. In return, Japan and South Korea became two of America's largest trading partners, supplying cars, semiconductors, electronics, and more. At the height of this cooperation, bilateral trade volumes soared past $300 billion annually. Canada, meanwhile, played a quieter but vital role, reliable, stable, and often overshadowed in Pacific diplomacy. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the Asia-Pacific supply chain revolved around the US dollar, US regulations, and US-centered trade architecture. Trust was implicit. Agreements were negotiated behind closed doors. When disputes arose, they were handled with discretion, diplomacy, and deference to long-term alliances. But the past decade began to chip away at that certainty. The first tremors came with Trump's original term in office, 2017 to 2021, where tariffs and trade wars became standard operating procedure. Allies were shocked by the sudden imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs on Japan and South Korea. NAFTA was scrapped and replaced by USMCA. Trust turned conditional. Biden's term brought temporary relief, but not a return to normalcy. The pandemic strained supply chains and raised questions about overdependence. Then came Trump's second term, and with it, a new level of volatility. By July 2025, the old rules no longer applied. A single post on Truth Social could send shockwaves through entire economies. Negotiations were no longer framed by diplomacy, but by pressure, optics, and domestic posturing. What began as a golden era of cooperation has now morphed into a high-stakes game of transactional threats, and the cracks are no longer just visible, they're structural. It wasn't a leak, it wasn't a policy paper, it wasn't even a closed-door negotiation. On July 8, 2025, Donald Trump posted a direct ultimatum on Truth Social. Unless Japan and South Korea signed new bilateral trade deals with the United States by August 1st, their exports would face an automatic 25% tariff. The announcement stunned Washington insiders and international markets alike, not just because of its content, but because of the way it was delivered. It was classic Trump, confrontational, unilateral, and intentionally disruptive. But in 2025, the global context had shifted. This wasn't 2018. America's allies were more cautious, more assertive, and far less forgiving. Trump's justification hinged on economic nationalism. In a campaign-style speech the following day in Detroit, he claimed, "We've rebuilt their economies for 70 years. Now they need to stop cheating us. This is about loyalty and fair deals." Behind closed doors, however, the calculus was more political than economic. The administration was facing mounting pressure from domestic manufacturing sectors, especially in swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, where layoffs in automotive and microchip industries had undermined Trump's America First promise. The tariff threat was meant to signal strength, rally the base, and reframe foreign trade as a litmus test for allegiance. But the global economy is not a campaign trail. The financial markets recoiled instantly. The Nikkei 225 plunged by 7.8%, its third largest single-day loss in modern history. South Korea's Kospi index dropped nearly 5%. On Wall Street, the Dow, Nasdaq, and S&P 500 all fell by nearly 1% in a matter of hours. The unease was less about the tariffs themselves and more about the volatility of the method. An international economic threat issued through a social media platform without prior consultation, coordination, or legal framework signaled a diplomatic vacuum. For Japan and South Korea, the message was clear. Long-standing alliances no longer guaranteed stability. Negotiations would now take place in public, under threat, with little room for nuance. This wasn't just a policy misstep, it was a strategic rupture. Instead of reaffirming American leadership, the announcement broadcasted a new reality. U.S. foreign economic policy could pivot on a whim, leaving allies exposed and markets in chaos. The backlash wasn't just overseas. Within the U.S., industry groups like the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce condemned the move. Republican governors from export-heavy states voiced concern. Senate Republicans privately called the messaging reckless, but the administration pressed on. The White House issued a statement later that week confirming the timeline and tariff rate and emphasizing that only loyalty and reciprocity will protect our partners from economic consequences. It was clear this wasn't negotiation, this was coercion. While Japan and South Korea scrambled to respond, another U.S. ally was watching. Quietly, cautiously, and with growing clarity. Canada, under the leadership of newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney, chose a dramatically different approach. Instead of meeting aggression with retaliation, Ottawa opted for restraint and calculation. Carney, a former central banker and global economic advisor, understood something fundamental. Reacting emotionally to political theater only amplifies its impact. Instead, Canada would respond with strategy, not statements. Publicly, the Canadian government issued no rebuke, no press conference, and no counter threats. Behind the scenes, however, Ottawa moved swiftly. It accelerated bilateral meetings with EU officials, tightened energy partnerships with Germany, and deepened logistical integration with Asia-Pacific partners, namely Japan and South Korea. Most critically, Canada presented itself as a stabilizing force in an increasingly erratic North American landscape. For Japan and South Korea, this message resonated. Within 2 weeks of Trump's threat, trade envoys from both nations met with Canadian officials in Ottawa and Toronto. Topics ranged from supply chain diversification to long-term energy contracts to joint research in semiconductors. By the end of July, Canada and South Korea had quietly signed a memorandum of understanding to expand energy trade, digital infrastructure investment, and academic exchanges. Japan followed with its own tech and agri-trade initiatives. The deals weren't flashy. They didn't make headlines, but they rebalanced relationships. Where the U.S. demanded loyalty, Canada offered reliability. It wasn't just diplomacy, it was economic realignment. At the same time, Carney's cabinet worked to insulate Canada's economy from American turbulence. Initiatives were launched to reduce supply chain dependency on U.S. inputs. Export financing incentives encouraged Canadian firms to target EU and Asian markets. Regulatory frameworks were updated to facilitate non-U.S. trade compliance. Canada wasn't reacting, it was repositioning. This trade shift also carried symbolic weight. It showed that middle powers, when coordinated and principled, could create alternatives to great power volatility. In the face of Washington's unpredictability, Ottawa's consistency became its greatest asset. While Trump's tariffs pushed allies away, Canada opened new doors, not with bombast, but with credibility. This shift didn't go unnoticed in Washington. A leaked memo from the U.S. Commerce Department described Canada's diplomatic triangulation as a potential long-term erosion of North American strategic leverage. In other words, the U.S. was losing more than contracts. It was losing trust. For decades, Canada was seen as the quiet neighbor, the dependable junior partner. But in 2025, it became something more, a diplomatic hedge against American instability. And for U.S. allies caught in the crossfire, Canada offered not just trade, but refuge. By August 1st, 2025, the deadline set by Trump had passed. Japan had negotiated a partial reduction, accepting a 15% tariff in exchange for a $550 billion investment pledge into American infrastructure, tech, and clean energy. The documents weren't yet public, but the direction was clear. Japan bought breathing room. South Korea, still locked in negotiations, was walking a tighter rope. Talks continued past the deadline, avoiding the full tariff for now, but trust had been damaged, possibly beyond repair. Canada, meanwhile, had emerged as the unexpected pivot point in the Pacific, not by power, but by posture. Yet the continent is at a crossroads. The US, increasingly assertive and transactional, seeks to control the rules of economic engagement. Canada, increasingly multilateral and disciplined, seeks to write new ones, but both exist in the same economic ecosystem, tied by geography, supply chains, and decades of legal infrastructure. This is the new paradox of North American trade: interdependence without alignment. And neither side can fully decouple without collateral damage. Washington may believe its market size grants it unilateral leverage. Ottawa knows stability grants it something longer lasting: trust. But with Asian allies hedging, trade shifting, and investment flows diversifying, the standoff is no longer temporary. It's systemic. Two neighbors, two models, one interconnected future. The only question left is whether that future will be competitive or cooperative. One of the clearest examples of collateral damage in Canada came from its tightly integrated automotive sector. In Windsor, Ontario, a city that lives and breathes cross-border car manufacturing, the Trump tariff threats sent shockwaves through factories that, for decades, functioned as extensions of Detroit's Big Three. In early July 2025, even before any tariffs were enacted, uncertainty alone caused ripple effects. Linamar Corporation, one of Canada's largest auto parts manufacturers, had just finalized a $180 million contract with a Korean EV battery firm. The deal would have created 220 jobs and added capacity for high-efficiency drivetrain modules. But the Korean partner suddenly pulled back, citing instability in North American policy environments after Trump's Truth Social ultimatum. The fallout was immediate. The project was paused indefinitely. Executives feared more Korean firms would begin rerouting manufacturing through Mexico or even back to Asia, where supply chain risks appeared lower. Government officials in Ottawa scrambled to reassure investors. Trade envoys reached out to Japanese and Korean counterparts to reaffirm Canada's commitment to free trade. Prime Minister Carney announced a $1.2 billion incentive package for cross-Pacific partnerships in the auto tech sector, but damage had already been done. It wasn't just about trade routes, it was about trust. Canada's proximity to the US, once an advantage, was now seen as a liability in a volatile political environment. Korean and Japanese companies began factoring US political exposure into risk assessments for Canadian deals. What used to be a strategic asset, North American integration, was becoming a vulnerability. The irony? Canada wasn't even the target of Trump's ultimatum, but in a continent as interconnected as North America, economic shock doesn't respect borders. Windsor's paused factory deal became a cautionary tale. Even strategic silence can't insulate a country from a neighborhood turbulence. While Canada's industries took a hit by association, American consumers and businesses felt the sting directly, and fast. In mid-July 2025, just a week after Trump's trade threat, several US importers of electronics and auto components reported sudden spikes in wholesale prices. According to the Yale Budget Lab, the uncertainty alone caused a temporary 10 to 17% increase in input costs across sectors like consumer electronics apparel and automotive assembly. By late July, Whirlpool, which sources components from South Korean suppliers, announced it would raise the retail price of several washer and dryer models by an average of 8%. The company cited anticipated disruptions in trans-Pacific component flow. Similar announcements followed from Dell, Nike, and Ford. For the average American household, this translated to a painful squeeze. According to a policy brief from taxfoundation.org, inflation-adjusted purchasing power declined by an estimated $1,900 to $2,300 per household in the second half of 2025, caused not by global shortages, but by domestically triggered uncertainty. It wasn't just price hikes, it was a shift in sentiment. A July 25th Gallup poll revealed that 70% of Americans had noticed a sharp increase in prices of essential goods. More alarmingly, nearly one-third of respondents said they had reduced discretionary spending or delayed major purchases due to perceived economic instability. Businesses felt it too. Small import-reliant retailers along the West Coast saw their profit margins collapse. Some even began sourcing from Canadian distributors who had pre-established trade pathways with Asia, effectively bypassing the chaos, ironically making Canada the fallback provider in a crisis caused by American policy. And yet, the most significant impact may be reputational. U.S. trade partners no longer view America as a consistent negotiating partner. The world's largest economy is becoming known for abrupt pivots, not policy. In this new global landscape, volatility isn't power, it's liability. The United States hoped that tariffs would bend allies back into line. Instead, they bent alliances in new directions, toward Ottawa, toward Brussels, toward each other. Japan and South Korea didn't just react, they recalibrated. Canada didn't retaliate, it redefined. Now, North America faces a moment of truth. The US still commands unmatched market power, but its political volatility undermines long-term trust. Canada, smaller but steadier, now attracts partners searching for reliability over dominance, and both remain deeply linked by trade, infrastructure, and geography. But the road ahead diverges. One path leads to renewed cooperation and shared prosperity, the other to fragmentation, mistrust, and self-inflicted loss. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or fail apart trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your view in the comments below.